I guess, so today, just to jump right in, I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Dr. Andrew Franks. Dr. Andrew Franks is a assistant professor of psychology at Lake Superior State University and former visiting assistant professor of psychology at Indiana University in South Bend. He earned his PhD in applied experimental psychology from Central Michigan University. His research interests include sexuality, politics, and the law, with a primary line of research aimed at understanding and ameliorating the lack of political acceptance. Boy, this is a tough one. The lack of political acceptance for atheism and secularism in the United States. His teaching experience includes courses in introductory psychology, social psychology, research methods, and statistics. Andrew's personal pursuits include punk rock music. He's a bassist, a vocalist, and lyricist. Mixed martial arts fighting with a 4-0 amateur record. And skydiving. He's done 30 lifetime jumps. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrew Franks.
Well, good morning and happy Mother's Day to all of you out there who are mothers. Thank you, Ray, for the introduction. As you were saying, my name is Andrew Franks. I am an experimental psychologist from Lake Superior State University, and my research has largely focused on social cognition and decision-making in high-stakes domains such as the legal system and politics. As an atheist and co-chair of the Secular Coalition for Michigan, I am deeply troubled by the hostility towards and lack of representation of secular ideas, atheism in the American political system. Much of my research has focused on quantifying and discovering ways to reduce anti-atheist prejudice with a goal towards strengthening the secular foundation of our democracy and contributing in some small way to the election of openly atheist individuals to public office. Today I'm going to talk about some of that research that looks at the strength of anti-atheist prejudice in American politics and some possible ways of remedying that situation. You may be thinking that, much like Herb Silverman, atheist candidates do not have a prayer of being elected to office. After all, anti-atheist prejudice is pervasive in the United States. A 2006 study found that nearly half of respondents would disapprove of atheists as marriage partners for their children, and that in that same study, atheists were chosen most often as the group that did not share the respondents' vision of what America should be. There are numerous reasons why people may have hostile attitudes towards atheists. American culture equated atheism with communism during the Cold War. People are uneasy about things they are unfamiliar with or don't understand. Right? A lot of people don't know that they know atheists, right? Because a lot of atheists keep themselves closeted. And a lot of people in the faith community don't understand atheism, right? Don't understand that all it means is that you don't believe in a God, right? It does not necessarily mean that you have no morals. In fact, many atheists have some of the strongest moral convictions of anybody that I know. But we as humans have this automatic tendency to categorize people into favored and disfavored groups. Also, atheists do not believe that, quote-unquote, God is watching. And without the constant threat of supernatural monitoring and punishment, religious adherents may think that atheists have no reason to act morally. Adherence to religious practices also demonstrates that a person belongs to the favored religious in-group, right? When you engage in the same religious rituals as somebody else, that signals to them that you are part of their group, right? Atheists, if they don't engage in those rituals, are going to be seen as not belonging to the group. Furthermore, when Christian conservatives were asked to imagine a world without God, they predicted that uncontrolled violent impulses and paranoia would tear humanity apart, and that life would be much like how it was described by Hobbes in The State of Nature. Solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. For religious conservatives, God is a Leviathan, and he is the only thing stopping people from cannibalizing infants. Right. Without God, we just would not be able to resist human veal. A lack of trust seems to be central to anti-atheist prejudice. For example, atheist targets elicited high levels of implicit distrust on an implicit association test, which is a reaction time measure of your ability to associate a person or group with categories of positive or negative words. Right, so you have an easier time categorizing atheism with negative words or with distrust words than you do with positive words or trust words, then you would have a bias against atheists. Atheists in this same series of studies were rated as more likely to be criminals than people of other groups, and they were rated as less desirable as child care workers, perhaps again because of the baby eating stereotype. Perhaps more detrimental than an unwillingness to allow an atheist to watch one's child is an unwillingness to vote an atheist into public office. Without political representation, non-religious Americans are often vulnerable to laws that privilege religion over irreligion. In fact, several states have statutes in their laws or constitutions banning non-believers from holding public office. Of course, the U.S. Constitution forbids such religious tests for public office. So one would assume that if those statutes were challenged in court, they'd be overturned. But an atheist would need to be elected to office in one of these states in order to have legal standing to challenge a law. That could prove difficult. As you can see, through the most recent presidential election in 2012, political acceptance of atheists was lagging behind political acceptance of gays, African Americans, and also several other historically disadvantaged groups that are not listed on this particular figure. Well, you can see the gray line represents acceptance of African American politicians, people willing to vote for an African American presidential candidate, which by the end of the century had reached a plateau at about 97%. Then the blue line represents people's willingness, the proportion of the population willing to vote for a gay candidate for president. You can see that started very, very low back in 1978, but has increased a lot over the 34-year span on this figure. But you see, atheism, in contrast, is much more flat. It's a much flatter line. People have not been coming around all that quickly to the notion of voting for an atheist candidate for president. Right. Now, the 135th Congress includes more women, racial minorities, ethnic minorities, and persons of minority sexual orientation than any Congress ever. However, there is still only one openly secular, not even openly atheist, just openly secular representative, Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona. Right? One out of 535 members of Congress. We used to also have Pete Stark from California, but he was gerrymandered out of his position in 2012. Additionally, atheists who currently hold public office may feel pressure to remain closeted about their atheism for fear of losing their positions. Think about Barney Frank. Barney Frank was reelected to the House 13 times after coming out as gay in 1987. Right, he'd already been serving for 6 years. Came out as gay and was reelected 13 times. But he chose to keep his atheism a secret until after his retirement in 2013. Though public polling indicates large differences between respondents' willingness to vote for atheists versus other politically underrepresented groups, I thought it was important to test these differences using experimental methods and outcome measures that were continuous rather than dichotomous, right? I didn't want to just ask yes or no, are you willing to vote for an atheist? I wanted to get a level like on a 1 to 9 scale. Very unwilling to very, very willing to vote for an atheist candidate, right? Because there are people who say no, I wouldn't be willing. They might vary in the strength of that conviction, right? And you might be able to turn somebody who says, well, you know, I'm a 3 out of 9 on my willingness to vote for an atheist. You might be able to make some leeway with that person. Maybe not with the person who says 1 out of 9, but maybe with that person who says 3 or 4. So I asked participants in my studies to indicate their likelihood of voting for a candidate on a 1 to 9 scale. Additionally, I wanted to describe an ostensibly real individual rather than a generic, quote-unquote, generally well-qualified candidate, because people might be more open to actually thinking about voting for a person if you give them more characteristics than just atheist, right? Describe their background a little bit more, make them seem more like a real person. Further, I figured it would be prudent to determine whether or not general feelings towards the group of atheists would also be focused on individuals who are atheist. So I manipulated whether the candidates were described as atheists, belonging to some other minority group, or being a typical white heterosexual Christian candidate. And all the candidates were men, because men still make up the overwhelming majority of Congress, still like 80%. Unfortunate thing to talk about on Mother's Day, but it's true. So all the candidates are described as male. And I measured how being a part of these various groups affected a participant's likelihood of voting for the candidate. I also examined the emotional content underlying anti-atheist prejudice, because understanding the emotions that drive anti-atheist prejudice is key to understanding and ameliorating it. So this is a figure from the first study I did on anti-atheist prejudice. You can see over here on the left-hand side of your screen, this is the voting intentions, and this is just for Christian participants here. You can see that the candidate who is of all of the majority groups, white, heterosexual, and Christian, received the strongest voting likelihood. Then over here, you see that the atheist candidate received the very lowest level of voting likelihood. And the same thing on the right-hand side here, a huge deficit of trust for the atheist candidate. We also took measures of disgust and fear, and we also found that people had higher levels of disgust and fear for atheist candidates than for your white heterosexual Christians. But there are some other things that were going on with the other minority candidates for those other emotional variables as well. We won't get into that, though. It's also interesting to note that among non-religious participants, non-religious respondents, they slightly preferred, the non-religious participants in the study slightly preferred the atheist candidate. Now, I decided to further explore the relationship between perceptions that a candidate does or does not believe in God and voter support for that candidate. Right? So, to what degree does somebody think that a candidate believes in God, and how does that affect their willingness to vote for that person? In addition, I wanted to examine the degree to which that relationship could be explained by the participant's religious affiliation and perceptions of the candidate as being trustworthy, right? Because if distrust is central to anti-atheist prejudice, then you should expect that a large proportion of this relationship here would be explained through this indirect pathway here, right? And if non-religious people are okay with non-religious candidates, atheist candidates, you should expect for this entire relationship to look different based on the religious affiliation of the participant. That kind of complex relationship in the field of statistics we talk about as being moderated mediation. That won't be on the test. Perceptions of God belief, trustworthiness, and voting intentions were all measured on 1 to 9 scales, with higher numbers indicating more of each variable. I allowed participants to select from a range of a range of religious affiliations, though I ultimately boiled it down to the affiliated, who were almost all Christian, and the unaffiliated, who were about evenly divided between people who said that they believed in a God but were not part of any particular faith tradition, and people who identified as agnostic or atheist. Here are the results for each of these dependent measures by candidate. I do not include the participant religious affiliation on this chart because the affiliated and unaffiliated only differed on their perceptions for one candidate, based on at a statistically significant level anyway. And that was for Ted Cruz. Right, for Ted Cruz, religious individuals were much more likely to say they're going to vote for Ted Cruz than religiously unaffiliated folks were. So as far as the rest of the candidates go, believers and non-believers were fairly similar in their perceptions of the candidates. As you can also see, my sample was also very strongly feeling the burn here. Voting intentions for Bernie Sanders much, much higher than anybody else. Makes perfect sense since this was an all-college student sample. If only we could get them out to the polls more often. So for Bernie Sanders, this is demonstrating the relationships between the variables for religiously affiliated participants, their perceptions of Bernie Sanders. You can see that for Bernie Sanders, all of the relationships are statistically significant as indicated by black arrows, right? So there's both a strong direct effect of perception that he believes in God. That is to say that among religious believers, the more they think that Bernie Sanders believes in God, the more likely they are to say they're going to vote for him. And then also this indirect pathway as well. The more that people who believed in God thought that Bernie Sanders also believed in God, the more they trusted him, and that in turn led to an increase in voting intentions. Now, when we look at the religiously unaffiliated, you see that those first two lines become non-significant. Right? Those relationships become statistically non-significant. So, of course, the amount that they trust the amount that they trust a candidate, that still predicts voting intentions. But the perception of whether or not he believes in God doesn't make a difference for the unaffiliated. Now, across all candidates, right? I collected this data about a month ago. I just finally got to take a look at it the past couple of days. This is when Cruz was still potentially viable. So I did the four candidates who were looking viable at that point: Sanders, Clinton, Cruz, Trump. Across all of them, it was largely consistent that a candidate's perceived belief in God is of little concern to the unaffiliated voter, but of a pretty sizable concern to those voters who are affiliated with a faith. So as you'll see time and time again as we go through each of these, the relationships between perceived God belief and other variables become statistically non-significant for the unaffiliated participants. And since young voters are increasingly unaffiliated with religion, this bodes well for the future of atheists in American politics. Let's take a look here. Hillary Clinton, same thing. For the religiously affiliated participants, all these relationships are significant. There's both a direct and an indirect effect of perceived God belief on voting intentions. She's kind of the outlier here. The indirect pathway becomes non-significant for the unaffiliated voters. Strangely, the direct pathway still had a barely significant effect. I don't know how to explain that, but one of the two pathways went away for Hillary. For Trump, all of these relationships are significant, both the indirect and the direct pathway. For The unaffiliated, those relationships go away, the relationships of perceptions that he believes in God. Of course, for the unaffiliated voters, you could see, if I go back to that really quickly, really nobody in the sample wanted to vote for Trump anyway here. He's way, way down here at a 2 out of 9 on voting intentions. Ted Cruz, same thing, from the affiliated to the unaffiliated. The religiously affiliated voters, of course, really perceived him as being very godly, and that's why he ended up having, I think, the second highest voting intentions in the group. For unaffiliated folks, they were much less likely to want to vote for Cruz than the affiliated folks, but they didn't really care about his God belief in particular. They just plain out didn't like him. All right. So beyond measuring the effects of being a non-believer, I am also interested in the effects of merely being associated with atheism on political support for a candidate. I expected that we may find anti-atheist prejudice to transfer to candidates who were not atheists themselves via a stigma by association effect, right? The stigma of being associated with atheism might lead lawmakers who are otherwise sympathetic to the same things that atheists are in support of. It may lead those lawmakers to not want to support those issues because they feel as if they're going to lose political support if they are rubbing elbows with dirty atheists, right? So what do we mean by stigma by association? Well, remember those Willie Horton attack ads that destroyed the Michael Dukakis campaign back in '88? Oh, I'm sorry, wait, that's the wrong Willie Horton. I'm too young to actually remember in 1988. There we go. The Willie Horton ads were emblematic of the way fear of black men can be used as a political weapon. Dukakis' image was repeatedly shown in succession with Horton's. Right, their faces flashed on the screen back to back, and his name was repeatedly mentioned in political attack ads blaming Dukakis for Horton's crimes. Right, this created both a perceptual and a semantic association between Horton and Dukakis. Right, perceptual in that you're seeing one face and then you're seeing the other face, and then semantic in that those two men are being woven together into this narrative, blaming one man for the crimes of the other. So I examined stigma by perceptual association with atheists by measuring preferences for unfamiliar but real political candidates under 3 conditions. I selected these 2 candidates from the website of the Pennsylvania state legislator. I figured that my students in Michigan would probably have no idea who these state legislators from Pennsylvania are, but these are faces of actual politicians. So I figured they'd be useful in measuring the stigma by association effect because my participants should start off with relatively neutral attitudes towards both of these men. Now, there are 3 conditions in the study, and what we did is we started off with this presentation, the slideshow presentation that was ostensibly a visual search task. They were supposed to watch the screen and indicate whenever they saw a certain stimulus pop up on the screen. In reality, what we were doing was we were creating a perceptual association between the faces and various words. Okay. In condition 1, candidate A's face was repeatedly displayed on the computer screen along with words related to atheism. Right. So most of the time, most of the participants did not notice this pattern, right? because they were looking for something else entirely. Right? They were watching out for something else entirely. But while they were on the lookout for some other stimulus to pop up, in one condition, it was this guy's face along with words that were atheist-related. Right? In another candidate, we used in another condition, we repeatedly showed the other guy's face along with words that were related to atheism. Right? And then in a third condition, both candidates' faces were repeatedly shown alongside neutral words, right? Words that had no emotional balance to them. The dependent variables in the study were, first of all, implicit trust, using an implicit association test. Explicit trust, how trustworthy do you view this candidate on a 1 to 9 scale, and voting intentions, also on a 1 to 9 scale. This is also fresh off the press data, just like the 2016 election stuff. So I don't have any figures. I didn't have time to put any figures together for this, except for this one to demonstrate what the implicit association test looks like. Right? So you have 2 categories are coded to each side of the screen, right? 2 categories on the left side of the screen, 2 categories on the right, right? So on the left, the two stimulus categories in this example are pictures of this fella or words having to do with mistrust. On the right side of the screen, pictures of this fella or words having to do with trust. Right. Participants are instructed to hit the E key when an image in the center of the screen belongs to a category in the upper left-hand corner, and to hit the I key when an image in the middle of the screen belongs to a category in the upper right-hand corner. Right, so right now, if you were doing this implicit association test, you would hit E because the face matches the one on the left, right? Then halfway through, you switch the associations, right? So you would start to put this face with trust words and this face with mistrust words. Right? So in this version, where you're using words that are related to trust and mistrust, if you were quicker, if you were able to more quickly and more accurately categorize one person's face with trust words rather than mistrust words, then you would show implicit trust of that person. If you had an easier time associating that person's face with mistrust words, then you'd be showing implicit distrust of that person. Okay. So in condition 1, when face A was presented during the visual search task along with atheist words, on all 3 measures, people preferred candidate B. Okay? Both implicit trust and explicit trust, as well as voting intentions. In condition 2, candidate A was trusted and elicited greater voting intentions. Okay? And in the third condition, where both faces were presented with neutral stimuli, the 2 candidates were evaluated more or less evenly. Okay. Now, another study I've done in the past looked at stigma by semantic association, right? What happens when a candidate who is not actually atheist supports atheist rights, right? So in another study, I had 3 conditions where a candidate who was otherwise described as being consistent across all 3 conditions, had a consistent background across all 3 conditions, varied on one key component, whether or not they were voicing support for a student loan reduction program, for marriage equality, or for repealing laws that prohibit atheists from holding public office. And found, of course, that are the candidate, when they were described as pro-atheist, they had a slightly reduced level of, this one I divided into Democrats and Republicans, a slightly reduced level of support among Democrats, but a really severe deficit of support among Republicans. And again, there was a mediation in relationship where a lot of that relationship between their support for atheist rights and reduced voting intentions was explained by a deficit of trust. And we were able to replicate this pattern of results using archival data from the 2012 U.S. presidential election. Respondents who viewed Barack Obama as more strongly associated with atheism were less likely to say that they would vote for him, and subsequently and they also showed less trust for him as well. Is this as bad as it all sounds? Perhaps not. These studies provide what may seem like a relentlessly pessimistic forecast for the political fortunes of atheists. But the situation may not be as brutally pessimistic as you think. Right? The religiously unaffiliated are the fastest growing group in the country, especially among the young. 1 in 3 millennials are unaffiliated, and they don't seem to have a problem with atheist candidates. And for most people who harbor some level of anti-atheist sentiment, other factors, such as a candidate's policy positions or their general popularity, may overpower concerns about a candidate's religious identity. Right? In these prior studies, there was a strong relationship, the relationship between the perceptions that somebody was atheist or was associated with atheists. Those things had a strong effect on whether or not people were willing to vote, whether people who were themselves religious were willing to vote for an atheist. But it did not tell the entire story, right? It explained about 9% of the variation in how religious people viewed atheists. So there's a whole lot of additional variance to look at. And there may be factors that are much stronger than whether or not the person believes in God. And that's exactly what I found in my doctoral dissertation, which I finished last year. So one thing that religious folks might think about atheists is they may think, if atheists do not believe in a moralizing God, then what are their morals? Do they have any? How can they be trusted? These questions might be asked by religious believers about atheists and motivate their distrust of atheists. People fear the unknown. But what if an atheist communicates a principled, populist message of secular humanistic morality? In the first of my dissertation studies, I manipulated whether or not an atheist candidate made a principled stand on secular policy issues. In choosing the secular policy issues, I decided to go with gay rights, child protection, and science education, because these three things I found in other studies that I won't go into more detail on here. These things I found them to be generally popular, at least among Democratic voters, and to some degree among Republican voters even as well. And these three things are also key components of former Maine Representative Sean Fairclough's vision of a secular America. And I recruited Christian Democrats only for this study. The primary dependent variable was the reported likelihood of voting for the candidate. And as hypothesized, an atheist received greater levels of voting intentions when they made a principled populist argument for secular morality than when there was no information given to the participant about the candidate's values. Another reason for anti-atheist prejudice is that people may perceive atheists as rare and may think that other people have negative views of atheism as well. Consistent with that idea, attitudes toward atheists among religious believers are more positive in areas where atheists are more numerous, right? When there are more open atheists, say like in some areas of this country, but especially in Western European democracies where atheism is very common, religious believers don't have negative stigma towards atheists, right? So if atheism seems like a popular idea, then people are more comfortable with it. Right? Our attitudes are affected by the attitudes of other people. We want to like what's popular. So my next idea for decreasing political bias against atheists was to use what is known as the bandwagon effect. The bandwagon effect occurs when a candidate's pre-existing popularity leads to additional gains in support. And it is well established in social psychology and political science. It also works with ideas. As support for civil rights and gay rights became more popular, those who were initially opposed to those ideas felt increasing social pressure to change their own values. Right? So in order to measure the strength of the bandwagon effect for atheist political candidates, I again manipulated whether an ostensibly real atheist candidate was leading or trailing in the polls. My sample was once again comprised of Christian Democrats, and my results supported the bandwagon effect. Voting likelihood did indeed increase for atheist candidates when they were described as leading in the polls than when they were described as trailing in the polls. The popularity rubbed off on the participant. My third dissertation study looked at another component that could increase people's propensity to vote for atheists, and that is analytical thinking. Now, day-to-day stress, say like the stress you might feel when you're constantly in a fight or flight state of mind because you're living in a world filled with poverty, crime, disease, resources that are not plentiful. These things inhibit your ability to engage in careful analytical thinking, and you have to rely more on your intuition, more on emotional reasoning. Where people live in these kind of situations, that's where religious belief flourishes most. That's where religious dogma flourishes most, is among people living in the most dangerous areas of the world. In areas of the world where people are more comfortable on a day-to-day basis, you see their reliance on religious dogma wane. And they become more secular. And they become more accepting of secular people and atheist people. Also, where quality of life is high, people are more free to engage in analytical thinking, to engage in free inquiry, and ultimately to break away from religious dogma and pursue scientific, rational pursuits. So in the final study of my dissertation, I examined whether or not an analytical thinking prime would reduce anti-atheist prejudice. Analytical thinking is thinking that is effortful and deliberate. And this is in contrast to intuitive thought, which occurs with low effort and automaticity. The image on the left, Rodin's The Thinker, has been shown to increase analytical thinking temporarily, to temporarily increase a participant's reliance on analytical thinking. Right? This image on the right, known as Discobolus, has been shown not to have that same effect. Right? Discobolus doesn't make people more intuitive at all, and Discobolus does not change whether or not they're thinking intuitively or analytically. Right? The Thinker tends to prime people to think more analytically, though. Now, in my study, I looked to see whether or not being exposed to the image of the thinker would simultaneously increase their analytical thinking skills temporarily, make them think in a more analytical mindset, whether it would increase their agreement with secular values, and whether it would increase their likelihood to vote for an atheist candidate. And I found a yes on all three. And that was consistent for both Democrats and Republicans in this sample. This sample included both Democrats and Republicans. So this figure demonstrates that the analytical thinking prime was consistently able to increase voting intentions for an atheist candidate among both Republican and Democrat participants. And of course, like I said, the prime also worked on those other two dependent measures. Again, a mediation relationship was found among several variables. It was found that analytical thinking, prime, increased agreement with secular public policies, and that this, in turn, largely explained increases in voting intention for the atheist candidate. That brings us back to the primary question of this presentation. Are unbelievers unelectable? Not the greatest way to phrase that, but I really wanted to use alliteration. Alliteration is fun. While other Western democracies have elected atheists to their highest offices and are in generally more socially accepting of atheists, the United States seems to have a de facto ban on atheists engaging in open public service. It's unfortunate, but the United States has also been decades behind in gaining political representation for other groups who have traditionally been underrepresented in government, such as gays and women. But I alluded to it earlier. Again, it's an unfortunate thing to talk about on Mother's Day, but women have far, far less than their proportionate representation in government. If it was proportionate, women would make up 51% of Congress, when in reality they make up just over 20%. But it's still quite a bit better than what atheists are doing. Right, remember, 1 out of 535. Again, groups such as women and ethnic minorities and gays have reached historic levels of representation in our government in recent years. Can atheists be far behind? Is an atheist president possible in our lifetime? Well, let's review those research results in a broader context. Right, several circumstances improve support for atheist candidates. First of all, secular morality. Right? An atheist benefited from strongly proclaiming generally popular secular principles. This is a positive finding because it means that atheists can create moral coalitions with liberals in the faith community. Though many religious individuals deny it, morality and religion are not one and the same, as everyone in this room knows. Morality has its roots in our evolved tendencies towards compassion, fairness, and social bonding. So-called religious morality violates these values as often as it promotes them. By shining lights on situations where religious dogma threatens children, education, or the fabric of our democracy, and offering viable alternative secular humanistic values, atheists may gain allies among those on the religious left and form a new moral majority to fight against religious harms and bigotry. Second, an atheist candidate also benefited from being described as popular and a long-serving incumbent who was presumed to win their re-election by a large margin. This is a positive finding because it means that an actual candidate who is currently hiding their atheism from their constituents, especially if they are in a very left-leaning district, they might be able to come out without it really torpedoing their chances of re-election. Overall, support for a generic, generally well-qualified atheist candidate has increased 4 points in just the last few years from the last presidential election, right? It was at 54% in 2012, as we saw in that graph earlier. It's now at 58%, and 75% among millennials. Younger generations are leaving organized religion in droves, and the youth bandwagon is moving in the direction of secularism and non-religion. Much like the gay rights movement, we should expect a dramatic generational shift in social and political acceptance of atheists to arrive within the next few decades, maybe sooner, as the younger voters replace older ones in the electorate. Then my final dissertation study implied that increasing analytical thinking skills and reducing reliance on intuitive thinking styles within the context of political decision-making could have long-term benefits for secular causes and the political acceptance of atheists. Shifts in thinking style could be achieved in a more sustained, long-term fashion through emphasis on analytical thinking skills in our education system. This is dually positive for secular humanists because the very education policies that secular humanists promote are likely to increase students' analytical thinking skills. And subsequently, those students will be more likely to support secularism themselves and to be more willing to vote for non-believers in political elections. It's important to continue our efforts to fight things like young earth creationism and its more insidious offspring, intelligent design, which crush people's analytical thinking skills. We need to promote scientific literacy rather than dogma in the science classroom, right? Atheists and secularists should focus also on improving quality of life in any way possible. As people feel less encumbered by environmental threats like poverty, crime, and disease, they become more free to think analytically, to question authority, to question dogma, to accept moral virtues that come from a place of reason. Taken all together, these research studies suggest a complex model for increasing political acceptance of atheists. Things like improving education, improving standards of living, those are going to turn people into more analytical thinkers. Right? Analytical thinking is going to lead them to reason-based secular values. It's going to lead them to be more willing to trust non-religious folks. And as these ideas become more popular, that will moderate the effects of trust and secular values on the voting behavior of voters. The United States is a nation founded on secular principles, such as the separation of religion and government. It is disconcerting that there are so few strong secular voices at any level of government, and that there's also a de facto religious test to hold public office in so many areas of the country. However, I think there is ample evidence to suggest that secular and atheist individuals will have increased political influence and representation in the near future. I was just lobbying Michigan state legislators in Lansing on behalf of the Center for Inquiry and the Secular Coalition for Michigan this past Wednesday. Though none of the legislators themselves identified as non-believers, many expressed enthusiastic support for secular policy positions. Now, of course, there might be a bit of a selection bias there because these are the legislators who were willing to take meetings with a secular organization. But those people are there. They are in the legislators. Now, further, several of their young staffers did self-identify as non-believers, agnostics, atheists, or secular humanists. Those young staffers are future politicians themselves. In 2016, a secular Jew who slyly dodges questions about his religious beliefs is making a serious run for the presidency. And Jim Raskin of Maryland is forecast to handily win a seat in the House of Representatives despite his apparent non-believer status. While progress is being made, we must continue to focus on understanding and reducing hostile feelings towards atheists, on promoting secular values and fostering analytical thinking skills in our young people. Not only will these strategies benefit atheists, but also non-atheists who fall into other groups harmed by religious bias in public policy. Women, persons of minority sexual orientations, and ethnic minorities, as well as children, are all negatively affected when governments lack strong secular voices. Increasing the representation of secular humanistic individuals and atheists will yield positive results for individuals in these other groups and reinvigorate the principle of church-state separation that is necessary for a healthy democracy. Thank you.
Hi. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the fact that Thomas Jefferson was elected president, even though he was fairly openly critical of Christian beliefs, and his detractors called him an atheist.
Yeah, it's a very strange thing that our founders were largely composed, although not entirely composed, of people who were not strongly affiliated with religion. Some of them outright rejected organized religion and were more, say, deistic, probably about as close to being thoroughly atheist as you could get in a pre-Darwin society. And these were the men who wrote the Constitution, who explicitly stated that religion had no part in the government. These were the leaders of our country at the beginning, and somehow we got to a point where those men with those ideas, especially over the last half of the 20th century, would have had no chance of being, I don't know why this is a term, they would have had no chance of being elected dog catcher anywhere in this country because of their views on religion. And it's lost in our history. It's lost in our history because the religious rights narrative has been that this has always been a Christian country, that capitalism and democracy, these are God's ideas. Jesus wrote the Constitution and handed it to Jefferson. The footsteps of a church. But that's not the way it works, right? That's a false narrative that we were founded as a Christian nation. Obviously, you're right, and we need to keep trying to pull that narrative back. Make the narrative the truth that this is a nation founded on secular humanistic values, and that's what our government needs to be.
My oldest son is named Jamie, so I was doubly stunned when Jamie Raskin won the Democratic primary in Maryland just 2 weeks ago. He won against a field of 8 other candidates and so was able to win the Democratic primary with just 33% of the vote. Do you have any idea about how he ran his campaign, how in spite of his well-known, he was at least well-known as a humanist and probably as an atheist as well, do you have any idea how he was able to achieve that victory?
So it's strange, nowadays it's more than 20% of the overall American population is religiously unaffiliated. And as we saw in my studies, those folks are very open to having non-believers represent them politically. So to win a Democratic primary, so most of your non-believers are going to be Democrats. Going to be more non-believers in the Democratic camp than in the Republican camp. And if you're a non-believer running for a Democratic nomination, you actually stand a pretty good shot, because probably if 20 to 25% of the electorate overall are non-affiliated, that probably means that among Democrats, it's closer to 40%. And so then all you got to do is win over, one out of every 6 believers to get a majority on the Democratic side. And in this case, since there were so many other folks running, 33% was much more than enough to win the nomination. Now, that also goes to show, though, however, that there may have been some folks out there who maybe did not vote for him because he was atheist, but more so voted for him in spite of him being atheist. That's because, as I said, even among those who are affiliated with religion, on average, right, it's going to be more, if you were to subdivide them into more groups and say, you're people who are really liberal but affiliated with religion, and you're people who are more moderate, and you're people who are more conservatively religious, it's going to be more or less, the perception that somebody's atheist is going to be more or less important if you subdivide it down like that. But among all religious believers combined in all of my studies, the importance of being perceived as an atheist explained about 9% of the variance. So there may have been other things that they liked about him. They could have voted for him in spite of the fact that, I don't know if I like that he's atheist, but, I agree with him on this issue and this issue and this issue, and he seems like a decent guy, so sure, I'll vote for him. Right, that's the difference between those people who would say on a scale of 1 to 9, all right, I'm like a 3, 4, 5 on a scale of 1 to 9 in my willingness to vote for an atheist, versus those people who are like a 1 or a 2 who just would never do it.
I have a question. So you just said that, well, I just want to say it my way, like 20% of the people in this country are non-affiliated.
Right, it's somewhere between 20 and 25 now, I think.
Okay. Yeah. Is it possible, and maybe it isn't, for you to make an estimate of how many atheists are elected officials?
Oh, let's see. The number. You're talking about out atheist or like overall? Overall. That'd be really, really difficult. I'm sure that the number of people who feel who feel deeply within their being that secular values are right, I'm sure that's more than 1 out of 535 members of Congress. I'm sure that there are a number of people who are in Congress who are actual non-believers, even, right? So 1 out of 535, those are people that's the one person who's willing to admit it, and one person who doesn't feel like it's going to be political suicide to come out and say this. So I'm sure there are more in Congress. I would not be able to venture a guess as to how many. I would think that it's very likely that it's somewhat close to the representation in the population, maybe somewhat less. There are some factors that might make it somewhat more because in Congress, they tend to be highly educated, and atheism and secularism is more common among highly educated folks. But on the other side of things, it might be dragged down a little bit that by a lot of people who are secular, humanist, atheist, they're going to be less likely to run for public office because they wouldn't feel comfortable either expressing their atheism or lying about being atheist or humanist or whatever. So I'm thinking it's definitely more than 0. But I would say it's probably somewhat less than the actual representation in the overall population. There's actually, a lot of people are thinking, especially like Bill Maher, Richard Dawkins. You hear murmurs from some of these folks, and it might just be wishful thinking. And it probably is, but there's probably a small chance that it's true. You hear murmurs that, after Obama leaves office, there's some folks who think we'll learn that he's a non-believer. And I don't fully buy into that, but I can see it as a possibility. And I think probably a lot of other Congress people after they retire, much like Barney Frank, might start coming out. And then you might start seeing some active Congress people come out while they're seeking re-election. And then you're going to see some people enter the political field already being openly atheist or secular or humanist.
Before I ask my question, I comment on one thing. The only scientist in the United States Congress, real scientist, is Chicago area guy. I asked him how many people in the science committee, which he is part of it, openly support Darwin theory. Openly, he says, difficult to say, less than 10%. He said in the science committee. Anyway, coming back to my question, the evolutionary psychological point of view, internationally, where Americans stand in evolving non-believers to believer status, since you showed some data showing they're increasing, younger people, especially non-believers. Evolutionary psychology is consistent with our evolution, originally probably believers, almost all people. Then we are growing faster now. Are we comparatively to internationally where we stand?
So you're right that evolution has sort of molded us to be very skeptical of evolution. We have been, our ancestors are those folks who formed moral communities with other folks by engaging in completely arbitrary religious rituals, right? In order to gain group membership and gain the protection of being part of the group, right? So our propensity to believe has been kind of bred into us. And it does take being pulled out of that, more state of nature where, every day is this struggle for survival. You have to be pulled out of that kind of world in order for people to really start emerging out of religious belief. We are lagging behind in terms of both our willingness to elect atheists and non-religious folks, as well as our levels of atheism in comparison to other Western democracies. And also in regards to our acceptance of scientific ideas such as evolution, right? Still, 50%, around 50% of Americans, perhaps a little bit more, reject evolution by natural selection, reject a common ancestry of humans and other animals. This is not the case in any other country in the developed world. These ideas are easily accepted by an overwhelming majority of the population. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that United States, more than any other nation, stigmatized atheism as being associated with those godless commies during the Cold War. And secondly, because the United States, more than other modern democracies, well, we're not quite as good at controlling our crime, we're not quite as good at controlling our disease, so we have a little bit more day-to-day threat. But we think, more than folks in other countries, we think we're in more danger than we are. Americans, we have a little bit more reason to be afraid on a day-to-day basis. There's a bit more violence here. Not as much, of course, as in like Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the third world. There's a little bit more violence, a little bit more disease here than in other first world countries. So maybe we have a little bit more to be concerned about in that regard. There's quite a bit more poverty. But it's not as big of a difference as you would expect based on our mindset. The mindset of the average American is much more fearful of, fearful of outsiders and fearful of new ideas than it is in a lot of other countries where people have a more relaxed, accepting attitude of non-believers. And more outgroups in general.
I teach in a secular college, and my area of teaching is the students are fairly religious. And I was wondering if you are out to your students and if you had had any problems with prejudice or bias when you were hired? Did they know that that's what you were doing your dissertation on? And, have you also had bias among other faculty members?
Well, I've had, in terms of my students, I'm fairly open. I don't actually come right out and say, on the first day of class, I'm atheist, I don't believe in God. Neither should any of you. Right, because it doesn't that's not directly involved in what I do. I do say that I do admit to researching anti-atheist prejudice, which probably which probably is a way of indirectly saying that yes, I am. And I do say that I do identify myself as saying, the things that I do in terms of public service involve working with Center for Inquiry and being the co-chair for the Secular Coalition for Michigan, and talking about the kinds of issues that I support in those roles. So it should be fairly obvious to my students that I am a non-believer. The problems that come up sometimes are like, more so come up when I have to mention some sort of negative psychological effect of religious belief. Right? If I have to say, if I say, well, if I say developmental psychology, talking about how those folks who are growing up in less educated countries or countries where the education system is poorer, they're more likely, that leads to people being more likely to be religious. True fact, but some people don't like that. They think it's stigmatizing religion. Studies demonstrate that this is a fact, and this is a component of this is something that affects people's development. So if you have a problem with the facts, sorry, they're still true. Usually my response to that, if people get angry, they don't typically get too upset. I'm still waiting for a student to slide a Bible underneath my door. When I interviewed for my current position, one of the other faculty members made a statement to that effect, saying, "Oh, I've had too many Bibles slid under my door here." He also was, talking about him being an atheist, and he's a sociologist, and often has to also talk about sometimes the negative correlations between religion and some quality of life factors. So you can see then that among my colleagues, right? So he was himself also a non-believer. What you find is that among the professorates in the social sciences, what's your area? Nursing. Along the faculty in the social sciences and as well as the natural sciences, non-believers make up the vast majority of your PhD level faculty in those areas. So it's not a problem among my immediate colleagues. I have heard, and I don't know if it's cost me jobs elsewhere, if they've passed on my CV because they see all of this atheist stuff, anti-atheist prejudice research, publications, presentations, sitting on the boards of secular organizations. Perhaps that has led some other institutions to toss my stuff to the wayside. It's hard to say because you never get any kind of feedback in the hiring process at universities. I've heard that among administration. And as far as getting promotion into administration goes, that can be hard because the schools don't want to have non-believers among their administration because people who are donors often have negative attitudes about atheism. And so, administrators have to engage in a lot of fundraising, and so they don't want non-believers perhaps hindering their fundraising goals. I don't want to be an administrator anyway. does not sound like my idea of fun. The research stuff, teaching, administration duties. My list of things I like to do in my job.
All right. Well, if everybody join me in thanking Dr. Franks for his great talk.